Good morning and welcome to the 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium. I'm Dr. Bob Mortlock. I'm the Principal Investigator for the Acquisition Research Program, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all. We have over 750 registered participants. We have 67 researchers and 23 distinguished panel chairs. We have a great two days full of packed research. I'd like to start off by giving a shout out. We have a very small acquisition research team here putting on this event, and they work for about 6 months planning this event. The small team of Kerry Schaefer, Shell Johnson, Nadia Greer, and Joshelle Benson have worked incredibly hard to put together this event for the last 6 months. We're often asked, what is the return on investment for research? And I just give a moment about it's allowing events like this to take place where researchers can share their incredibly hard work with other researchers and policymakers, and the end result is we can make then informed decisions about acquisition transformation, acquisition policy changes, if we utilize these avenues. I would ask the participants, please challenge the researchers, ask the difficult questions, and challenge them, because that's how we advance the state of acquisition research. There's been incredible transformation in the acquisition area over the last few years. We've transitioned in the back to the basics from 14 different career fields to 6 functional areas. And an equivalent level of transformation has taken place in acquisition education right here at NPS through the NPS Next transformation. The Navy has given us the ability to now offer 1-year Master of Science degrees in 6 of those functional areas: program management, contract management, financial management, and lifecycle logistics management. We also offer 2-year Master of Science degrees in a distance learning avenue. Supporting those programs, we also have stackable certificates in those functional areas. And the reason I mention all this is because underpinning all this research is our student or scholar warriors who perform research in all those areas, and the acquisition research program brings that together. So there's transformation not only on the certification of our acquisition workforce and the training of our acquisition workforce, but also the graduate level education of our acquisition workforce. And all that supports us for doing our mission of delivering capability at the speed of relevance to our incredible warfighters, providing security for our nation. At this time, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Admiral Dave Lewis, a former Defense Contract Management Agency commander, commander of the Space and Naval Warfare Systems Command, PEO Ships, and Vice Commander of Naval Sea Systems Command. So this is a man that has forgotten more about acquisition than I can remember. So Admiral Lewis, over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. So welcome everyone to the premier acquisition symposium for the Defense Department. It's not only the premier, it's the only acquisition research symposium in the Defense Department. And this is the place where everybody comes to share their research, their ideas, their discoveries, and is intended to be an open and free discussion amongst you, the registered participants, and the authors of the papers and our distinguished speakers. So I encourage you to not be shy, ask questions. You don't often get an opportunity to go one-on-one with a senior political appointee or a researcher at an academic institution. So take advantage of it. We've also scheduled coffee break times, which are free discussion items. Our speakers are welcome to sit in on those. They are intended to exactly emulate, after the session is over, everybody goes outside to get coffee. And that's when the most interesting conversations happen, often one-on-one. So those are available throughout the schedule. I'd also encourage everyone to attend our student presentations. We have 16 student presentations. About 30 students will walk you through their thesis and project work. It's a great opportunity to see the cutting edge of student work here at the postgraduate school. So please take advantage of these 2 days and get as much out of this as you can. This symposium is a result of a full year of research by literally dozens and dozens of institutions and dozens of researchers. A deep thought, and you can participate next year if you want. If you got a great idea, write a paper, give us a proposal, and you can be one of the presenters next year at our 20th symposium. So it's my pleasure to introduce Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, retired, who is the Navy Postgraduate School president. She has had a long career as a distinguished naval officer and is an accomplished educator. NPS is her third ride as president of an institution of higher learning. So over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Admiral, and welcome to everybody who's here. We are delighted to have you at this 19th Annual Acquisition Research Symposium. And I must say, prior to continue on with my other comments, is a deep thanks to Admiral Dave Lewis, to Bob Mortlock, and the team at our Defense Management School and Department. They are doing great work in leading, and this symposium is but an example of that. For 19 years, this event has brought together an interdisciplinary mix of perspectives from industry, academia, government, and other places to provide, which would include even our international partners, to provide a 360-degree view of acquisition as a war-fighting tool. As we like to say, acquisition is how we bridge the valley of death. But we need to understand how to do that in the Eachers. But it is how the Navy and the Department of Defense and the services overall deliver technology and capabilities to operators in the field. Nothing gets done without acquisition. And this event creates new knowledge to make the processes and people work together. So about new knowledge. There are many places that so competently and brilliantly train acquisition, but NPS is a place that brings together those seasoned operators and acquisition professionals and warfighters. And they come together and not only think about their training in the past and their experience, but also the education that advances the science and the competencies within acquisition overall, strategically, operationally, networked, in a joint environment, and in the environment that today is so volatile and dynamic. Who would have thought about acquisition with the Russians invading Ukraine? And yet we are now discussing that and trying to make that work. So we are at a place that truly underpins our Warrior Scholar students, our faculty, and our operators, and all of the access to research, contributing to the information, the education, and the dialogue that informs policy so that we can all move better at the speed of relevance. As Bob Mortlock says, that is our charge. So this year, the symposium is certainly co-hosted by the Acquisition Research Program, but here at NPS, also the Naval Warfare Studies Institute that is working to bring guidance and the warfighting requirements and imperatives together in tandem with the acquisition art and skill set, so that our scholars, our faculty, our warrior scholars, our students, and everybody else is in this enterprise. So one of the highlights of this symposium are the students, and they are in many ways the informed consultants to what's happening today. So they will come and they will brief up and they will present, and they will also show you their posters which is a great kind of a one-page slick sheet about really complex problems, and they will showcase the work of these great Warrior Scholar students. So 18 papers and projects, as Bob and Dave have indicated, with students who will be graduating, briefing, and they invite you to help them and to join the conversations in these sessions. Students apply their operational knowledge. They will brief it up, but they come to us from their previous assignments, very focused on where they're going next. They are the powerhouse of Naval Postgraduate School of this symposium. So with that in mind, please let the event now continue with this great and rich dialogue. Dave or Bob, back over to you.
Thank you, Admiral. Appreciate that. It's my pleasure to introduce our first principal speaker, Mr. Andrew Hunter. He is no stranger to this symposium, has been an active participant as a researcher and as a speaker for many, many years. So, Mr. Hunter, welcome back in your new role. Mr. Hunter was confirmed as the Senior Acquisition Executive for the Air Force in February of 22. Took a brief sojourn up as performing the duties as the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Sustainment, and now he's back in his saddle in the Air Force, and happily so, I'm sure. Prior to his nomination and confirmation, he was a senior fellow in the International Security Program and director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Groups at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I had the pleasure of serving on a couple of panels with him. Always learn something out of those events. His prior tours in the Department of Defense were as a director of the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell. And he also served as Chief of Staff to Secretary Carter and Secretary Kendall when they were serving as USD AT&L. And he's also had a long and distinguished service with the House of Representatives and the Armed Services Committee, and on personal staffs of several representatives. He's a graduate of Harvard University and has a master's from Johns Hopkins. Mr. Hunter, over to you. Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Admiral Lewis. And thanks also to Dr. Mortlock and Admiral Rondeau for the opening remarks. I'm really excited to be back at the Acquisition Research Symposium, the 19th. I'm trying to remember which the first one was I went to. I think it may have been the 12th. And if I'd been lucky, I would have been to some of the earlier ones as well. But at least I got to join you a few years back. The Acquisition Research Symposium is really the premier forum for understanding, discussing, planning acquisition research, and for exchanging information and ideas about acquisition. And I'm excited to be back with you. I'm hopeful that this research program, which is outstanding and has been for many years, can continue and also will grow and sort of resume some of the research approaches that we were able to accomplish over the last decade, which have been a little hard to do in the last couple of years, in some cases due to funding limitations. I'm excited to speak to you today and be the warm-up act for tomorrow's, all-star Jay Stephanie. I know who's going to be giving the opening remarks tomorrow, but I'm glad that you invited the Air Force as today's principal speaker, and just excited to be with the group. I'm going to talk to today's topic, creating synergy for informed change, by looking at how we're approaching that right now within the acquisition system in the Department of the Air Force. And I'm going to touch on some of our departmental priorities that flow to us out of the National Defense Strategy, and that are being implemented in many ways in the Air Force, or being challenged. The acquisition system is being challenged by our operational imperatives, which are designed to allow us to accomplish the missions that we're tasked to do in the National Defense Strategy. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're leveraging the adaptive acquisition framework to meet those imperatives, and the efforts that we're making to invest in our workforce and in our culture to have a more agile, digital and software savvy workforce and acquisition system to drive success in these endeavors. So I think, just as Admiral Rondeau indicated, we're working very hard to link the work that we're doing in the acquisition system to the operational needs and to deliver the capability that's required there in an agile and responsive way. So I'll start with kind of the priorities that are driving us in the Department of the Air Force Acquisition System. And as articulated in the National Defense Strategy, China is the pacing challenge, and it's very much driving our behavior. There are other challenges as well that are worth noting. Russia remains an acute threat, and we know that U.S. security writ large is underpinned by a resilient and capable nuclear triad that we are very much working to modernize the current time frame. And so these missions, these imperatives are very much driving what we're doing. And I like to say that, the pace of our pacing challenges is quite fast. So, we're dealing at this point right now with a sprint. And, the nature of defense work is it's probably a sprint and a marathon simultaneously, which is a special challenge for us. It drives the need for us to be able to rapidly field advanced capability that can address clear and compelling operational needs that we see in the near term. And that has not always been the case in the defense acquisition system. At times, we may not have had a clear operational challenge that was in the near term, or the nature of the operational challenge we faced may have been to kind of adapt our processes to a lower threat environment, but a complex threat environment. And in the current situation, we have a complex threat environment that's also incredibly challenging at the high end of conflict. So the Secretary of Air Force has really given the entire Department of the Air Force a mandate to accelerate the delivery of operationally relevant capability to the warfighter. And that's very much a challenge to the acquisition system as it is to the entire enterprise. And for us, it's a challenge that we have to meet at a time that, while the budget is growing, we're also seeing significant growth in our costs, which puts a squeeze on our overall resources and how we allocate them. As I mentioned, we're modernizing two legs of the nuclear triad, and we're managing several aircraft fleets with a large number of aging platforms that are expensive and challenging to maintain. And at the same time, our operating costs, such as the fuel bill, are growing, and we're feeling inflation's bite and COVID's impact on our supply chains all at the same time. And this, fight for constrained resources is reflected in our FY23 budget request. For those who've had the time or the interest to review the Air Force's FY23 budget request, you'll note that there's quite a number of aircraft divestments in that budget request. That's because we face a compelling need to divest to invest. We have to make hard decisions on maintaining or retiring legacy systems so that we can use those resources to invest in the capabilities that we're going to need in the fights that we project we need to be prepared for in the near future. So we're looking to divest legacy platforms that don't provide operational capability that help us meet our most significant threats as we invest in the capabilities that make the difference between success and failure in our critical missions. It's not only a budgetary issue. I mentioned the budgetary constraints that we have, but it's a matter of all our resources. Just as significant as the dollars that are tied up in our aging platforms are the air crews and the maintainers who operate those systems and are not available to help us deliver more modern systems because they're focused on operating today's systems to the high standard of safety, professionalism, and excellence that the Air Force requires. And in many cases, it's the people resources and the organizational resources that we need to shift in addition to the budgetary resources. So in order to answer the question of where we need to divest and where to invest, the Air Force has organized around examination of 7 key operational imperatives that Secretary Kendall has tasked us in close collaboration with the service chiefs for both the Air Force and the Space Force. And across these imperatives, the Air Force and the Space Force are doing the detailed analysis required to help us understand what capabilities we really truly need and what the investments are required to deliver them. And so the purpose of this analysis is to inform our plans to change, or as the Chief of the Air Force, General Brown, puts it, to accelerate change or lose. So I want to touch on these 7 operational imperatives, which are really driving the Air Force acquisition system, to give you a sense of how we're tying our efforts to those operational imperatives. Now, the first operational imperative that Secretary Kendall and the chiefs identified is defining and resourcing a resilient, effective space order of battle. So in addition to the organizational changes of creating the Space Force and standing that up to recognize space as a warfighting domain, we have to organize forces to actually carry out that mission set. And the task here is to ensure that terrestrial forces have support from space upon which they've come to depend, and to deny our adversaries the operational services they expect from space. And we're going to do that by beginning to transition to a more resilient missile warning and communications architecture, and working closely with the intelligence community to define joint solutions to our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance needs from space. The second operational imperative is achieving operationally optimized ABMS JADC2 capabilities. This is the joint all-domain command and control capabilities, with the Advanced Battle Management System, ABMS, being the Air Force contribution to JADC2. ABMS will ensure that air and space forces are able to share information with the joint force to target enemy forces, ensure situational awareness for friendly forces, and give warning and support to allies. We're funding the early increments of ABMS, including a communications node on the KC-46, and the fusion of several streams of data for our Homeland Air Defense mission in support of NORAD and NORTHCOM. And the Secretary of the Air Force is looking for us to focus on increments that provide the highest operational return in the early stages of the ABMS effort. Over time, ABMS will leverage emerging network solutions across the force, including a new space data transport layer that's in development with the Space Development Agency. The third imperative is to achieve moving target indication at scale. And this requires us to be able to track surface and airborne threats across an entire theater of operations. We're transitioning from aging platforms like JSTARS and AWACS, which have contributed to this mission, to new platforms like the E-7 Wedgetail aircraft and space-based approaches to this problem set. And we're honing the capability to sort out myriad targets and rapidly provide information to the people who engage those targets via the ABMS system and in support of JADC2 for the Joint Force. The fourth imperative is to develop and field the next generation air dominant system of systems, or NGAD. NGAD is the next generation fighter, 6th generation, that will ensure future air dominance. And it will operate as part of a system of systems that includes uncrewed combat aircraft and a cost-effective mix of sensors and weapons that underlie the capability required to achieve air dominance. The fifth operational imperative is defining optimized resilient basing, sustainment, and communications for forward deployed forces. China has fielded long-range weapons that threaten our operational air bases in the Indo-Pacific. The Air Force must invest in a cost-effective mix of hardening, active defense, deception, and dispersion activities to counter these threats. And we look to expand and leverage the agile combat employment concept, being able to rapidly relocate forces to complicate enemy targeting and ensure we generate sufficient combat power in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. The sixth operational imperative is defining the B-21 long-range strike family of systems. The B-21 is our global conventional strike capability. It's the center of that capability. And we're defining how this capability can most effectively address the most challenging operational problems confronting our forces in an anti-access area denial environment, such as we expect to see against our pacing and most acute threats. Like NGAD, B-21 will operate as part of a family of systems that increase its overall effectiveness. And the seventh operational imperative is evaluating the readiness of the Department of the Air Force to transition to a warfighting stance vis-a-vis peer competitors. We must ensure we're ready to move to the next fight and to sustain our platforms and our people to win the fight safely and effectively. And that requires modernizing and hardening our information systems. So these are the operational imperatives that we've been challenged by Department of the Air Force leadership in the acquisition system to deliver solutions to and meaningful capability in the next several years to support our warfighters. And it's a challenging task. So over the last several years, quite a bit of work has been done to demonstrate and prototype capability, much of which, in fact, addresses several of these imperatives. In fact, some of the operational imperatives are effectively organized around systems that have been in development in our acquisition system over the last several years to deliver the needed capability. So in that sense, we are in a good position that much of the work that we need to do has been prototyped and demonstrated in the last several years. But by the same token, it's a real challenge to actually field that capability and to move from a demonstration or a prototype to a meaningful operation capability at scale. And this is our challenge. So in the Air Force Acquisition System, one of our primary tools, I would say probably the primary tool for enabling us to deliver on this task is taking a digital acquisition approach to our efforts. Digital acquisition allows us to, if executed properly, will allow us to enable rapid technology insertion into our fielded systems. So we can deliver capability fastest by delivering it to the platforms that we have today. An example of that would be, as I mentioned, a communications node on the KC-46 platform that will help enable our advanced battle management system. It'll help us deliver lower costs to modify or iterate designs to address emerging operational problems. We hope to enable expanded sources of supply and utilized advanced manufacturing capabilities to reduce time and cost in starting production of our new systems. Excuse me. Some of the efforts that we're undertaking the Department of the Air Force to expand our digital engineering capability include updating our acquisition policy and guidance and our education and training. We're establishing a digital campaign and a digital transformation office. We're partnering with industry critically because our digital engineering efforts can only be successful if they're matched by complementary efforts within industry that can partner with us in doing digital acquisition, as well as working with the other services in academia to deliver the understanding of how to effectively utilize defense acquisition and how to deal with sticky issues like intellectual property that inevitably arise as chief concerns in digital acquisition. And I would just say, the issues and the challenges of intellectual property have always been with us. And I, in many ways, see digital acquisition as a way to empower us to wrestle effectively with those issues early in the program life cycle. But it does require us to step up our game on these efforts and address those issues early and resolve them. And I think our research partners, academic partners can greatly facilitate our ability to accomplish that objective. Digital engineering will help us increasingly secure and share data and store necessary data in ways that we can access it between government users, our industry partners, and we hope increasingly with a larger scope and variety of industry partners who can contribute to the effort. We're implementing enterprise product lifecycle management tools and capabilities across our PEOs and across our programs, and trying to leverage enterprise tools to help us do effective software development and software acquisition. And we're incorporating digital language, approaching requirements with flexibility into our contracting efforts. And we have several pathfinders underway where our PEOs are assessing opportunities to implement digital approaches across their portfolios. And it's not going to look necessarily the same across every program, although we are trying to leverage our enterprise approaches to help bring some commonality to the system. but individual programs, may approach digital acquisition in different ways. It is the case, however, that all of our new programs are being born digital, so they will incorporate these capabilities on the front end. And our current legacy and sustainment programs will do business case analysis to evaluate when it makes sense for them to engage in digital acquisition, do digital twins, and incorporate more digital approaches for our legacy platforms. And I'll talk more about one of those in a minute. And as I mentioned, strong partnerships are absolutely critical to digital engineering. We have to have a strong digital infrastructure that allows us, to create these large, complex digital environments in which we can do, system design and development, systems production engineering and sustainment engineering in where possible, where we can, and linked or even in single common digital environments to carry out these activities. Significant implications for digital infrastructure. Fortunately, the commercial structure and industry that enables that is there, and we're working to leverage that. And as I mentioned, not just for government program offices and government users, but for our industrial partners as well. And many of our operational imperatives that the Secretary of the Air Force has given us show the need to have these interconnections among programs and the ability to share data information, such as in the ABMS program. And we need the ability to plug and play and make decisions that allow us to exercise mastery of our technical baselines across programs, avoiding stovepipes where possible. The result of that digital approach to acquisition is anticipated to be that we can better manage these interfaces and interconnections among programs so that we have the linked and threaded and consistent connections between programs and that deliver the capability that the warfighter needs to close operational chains and kill chains in a highly contested environment. In addition to leveraging digital acquisition, we're going to be leveraging the adaptive acquisition framework to allow us to meet this challenge. Most of our programs still actually follow a traditional acquisition structure. The Air Force has been a early and active embracer of the middle tier of acquisition, and we have a number of middle tier programs, but we also have an even larger number of traditional major capability acquisition programs. So we have 44 middle tier programs currently and over 400 major capability acquisition programs. We're also looking and evaluating and learning and understanding the ways in which these are not fundamentally separate pathways, but complementary pathways, and programs can cross from one pathway to the other at the appropriate point in their development. MTAs fill a gap in the acquisition cycle for capabilities that have achieved a level of maturity already, or where we can rapidly prototype to increase the level of maturity and therefore get to fielding between 2 to 5 years. And the MTA pathway has allowed us to accelerate capability maturation before transitioning to the traditional pathway or another acquisition pathway, and be used to do modest levels of capability development prior to rapid fielding. Now, this approach it gives the program manager more control and flexibility to be innovative in program execution and do the program tailoring that Secretary Kendall has long advocated. And at the same time, it forces our program managers to think about what's critical to their success and to set guardrails to keep programs on track. MTA has helped us to get programs started more quickly, reduce risks, and then be able to be in a better position to deliver the most needed operational capability early in a program's life cycle, rather than necessarily seeing it show up as a increment 3, 4, or 5 in the program's program life cycle. And one example that I wanted to mention, because it kind of fuses the middle tier of acquisition and is an interesting example of digital acquisition, is our B-52 commercial engine replacement program, or B-52 CERP. which is a large and complex modernization program that replaces the B-52's current engine, the Pratt & Whitney TF-33, with new military derivative commercial Rolls-Royce engines, the F-130, of similar size, weight, and thrust characteristics. And in many ways, the focus on this program has been as an engine replacement program. But when you get into the guts of it, there's more change inside the aircraft than there is work being done to change the engine. Because it is a commercial derivative engine, the changes to the engine are relatively modest to the commercial engine that we're acquiring. But the changes in the internal systems of the aircraft are actually quite significant and quite profound. And they are taking, the vast bulk of the engineering work is there. And this is where digital engineering has been critical, because it's allowed us to create a digital twin of one of the oldest aircrafts in the Air Force inventory, the B-52, so that we can do the detailed engineering required to make this re-engineering program a success. And significant software development is required in this effort. It's not just about coding new software, but about understanding the guts of our aging platforms like the B-52 and all the associated subsystems, such as engine struts, nacelles, electrical power generation system, and the systems all the way into the cockpit that allow the pilot to effectively utilize those systems. So we've done the digital twin, digital engineering work through a virtual prototyping middle tier of acquisition program, which we anticipate will then feed into a major capability acquisition program to field and do the production work of installing the engines and making the modifications to the aircraft down the road. We've been learning as we've done a number of MTA approaches, how to make MTA successful, where it works best, how we make this transition to major capability acquisition programs once a rapid prototyping effort has been successful. And we continue to learn and evaluate and adjust our implementation to make use of the authorities and flexibilities most effectively. Pathways are just a means to an end. Ultimately, it's the work of acquisition, it's the engineering work, the systems engineering work, which is consistent in many cases over time, that ensure acquisition success and delivering capability, and put us in a good position to write good software, to manage supply chains, and to prepare our workforce for meeting these challenges. And then I do want to just mention another critical enabler for us is our workforce, the workforce and culture within our acquisition system that is necessary to do the complex work of digital acquisition and to do the kind of tailoring that the middle tier of acquisition has been allowing us to enable. So we have to manage our workforce to adapt to these challenges. This back to basics approach, I think, has been helpful, has been successful in these efforts, so that we make sure that our workforce has the skills they really need to accomplish their jobs, and the basic skill sets, and then the detailed competencies and skill sets that they really need to accomplish their missions. And the training is really tailored to delivering those outcomes for them, and they have the ability to choose which courses are most critical to them in those efforts. So I kind of want to wrap up my opening remarks there and turn to audience questions. I really think that this forum is a great way to discuss how we use the tool sets that the department and the Congress have been providing to the acquisition system to achieve those ends. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. That was excellent. We have several questions from the audience. They are not softballs, so I'll warn you up front. Before we do that, it's good to hear about the B-52. My mother worked on the B-52 program, and her job title was computer. Engineers gave her numbers, and she went into formulas and gave the engineers answers on her slide rule. So I always have a soft spot in my heart for that program. So.
Well, clearly she did excellent work, because it's one of the best engineered platforms in human history, I think.
Well, thank you. So first question from the audience is, Can you talk about what you see as the difference between digital acquisition and digital engineering? You touched on it in a couple areas, but can you refine that a little bit, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So to my mind, digital acquisition, I'd say we have to think of it as the big A acquisition. And during the time when I was coming to NPS as a researcher, we talked a little bit about this, about how there are inherent structures within our acquisition process that aren't necessarily, that date from an era where we weren't doing digital acquisition, and that may require some revisiting or some modification. And so a lot of those actually, and I know there's a question in the chat about contracting, but a lot of those are on the requirements and the budgeting side of the process, because it really requires us to be much more iterative and to revisit our requirements processes on a very regular basis in order to establish what are the, from my mind, to really do digital acquisition, what are the requirements and the user capabilities that are most important that we have to deliver first and early in a program's life cycle. And we have to be willing to shift and adjust as that changes in a dynamic environment like the one we've confront today. And our budgeting system simply wasn't designed for that. It was designed to be able to predict, in a 2, 5, 10-year time frame exactly what our program plan was going to be. Wasn't designed. In fact, was designed to sort of drive out some of what you would now call flexibility that might have been called churn or confusion in the past. And so to me, digital acquisition, it's about organizing and training and equipping the acquisition system and the enterprise to enable effective acquisition of digitally intensive systems. And digital engineering, and I say this as a non-engineer, so maybe this is the modestly informed perspective, but digital engineering is much more about using digital tools to accomplish the systems engineering tasks and the production and sustainment engineering tasks and design engineering tasks that we've always had. And in fact, Secretary Kendall is fond of saying, we've been doing digital acquisition my entire career, right? Every system he's worked on going back to the 80s was designed in a digital environment. And so in that sense, digital engineering has always been there and may not be dramatically changing, but it's linking together systems that used to be separate. And as I said, the enabling functions within the big A acquisition system that allow us to be effective.
Okay. All right, thank you. Another question from the audience is on intellectual property. You raised that in your remarks, and I know it's been a long and tortuous path. I've been involved in it several times. I try to run away from it, but it keeps coming back. So Dale Moore asked a question, would it be possible for OSD to develop a set of intellectual property contractual options with pros and cons so that PMs could select and use upfront and early for competitive solicitation? So I interpret that we have a thing out here called In-N-Out burgers, and you can order custom stuff, or you can just order a number 1 or a number 2 and get your double that way, and it makes it much easier. So I think that's where Dale is going. Is it possible to predefine IP packages or something that a program manager can just pluck off the menu and stick into a contract?
Yeah, I think it is possible, and I think we do need to do that. And I think, I'll be honest. So I think in many cases, the Navy's been a leader in some of these efforts, and going back even to the ARCI initiative and how they pioneered a lot of the techniques that I would now characterize as digital acquisition techniques. And so I will, of course, look to NPS to deliver us these best practices, and then OSD can hopefully just ratify and adopt them. But and there's a variety of ways to do it, right? When people come to me and sort of critique the FAR and say, we've got to get rid of the FAR, I think there's value in some of our FAR clauses because they represent time-tested solutions to problems that contracting officers have and that industry has in negotiating with the government. And so not all FAR clauses are the same and are good, but a lot of them are pretty practical solutions to real problems. And in a similar case, I think, these components, if you will, for addressing common intellectual property challenges and good ways of resolving them is a really good thing. And I kind of call that, the source code of acquisition, where you take things that have been proven to work and you use them, as building blocks of your source code to solve the problem. So I'm a big fan of that approach. I think that's where we need partners like NPS to help us. I think we have made progress as I review our acquisition strategies, which I've already had the chance to dive deep on 2 or 3 of them in the 3 weeks that I've been in this Air Force job. I am seeing a lot more maturity in or at least what I observe in our acquisition strategies about understanding what the intellectual property issues are that are critical to success. So intellectual property strategies that are much more sophisticated than the ones I would have seen in my prior government service. So I think we are making progress, but I think the suggestion here is really helpful.
All right. By the way, the first question was asked by Anne Laurent. Just wanted to give her credit for asking. Next, we have a question from Gregory Sanders. How important is modular open systems to digital acquisitions? What steps is the Air Force taking to fund common needs of digital acquisition to address the sometimes perverse incentives at the program level?
Well, I think the first part of your question is a lot easier than the second part, Greg, and good to hear from you. And thanks for sending me a hard question. I'll have to talk to others about that, but no, just kidding. So I do think modular open systems architecture is foundational to successful digital acquisition. It is possible, I think, to contemplate a digital acquisition approach that doesn't focus perhaps on modular open systems. You could imagine a digital acquisitions infrastructure in which we were dealing with more proprietary approaches, but it would be substantially less effective than what I was attempting to describe as our approach to digital acquisition, because so much of the capability that we really have to deliver here is the ability for platforms to exchange information with one another. And that is massively enabled by effective modular open systems architectures. And so I know in terms of the tools that it takes to be effective in that, there's a lot of possibilities. One that we are working very hard on in the Air Force is a government reference architecture that will enable our design efforts in a lot of systems that kind of fall in the basket, some of the baskets that I mentioned, some of our family of systems programs, NGAD and B-21, so that platforms within the family of systems and different capabilities or nodes within the family of systems are able to effectively exchange data because they're operating according to common architectural approaches and standards. And so, government reference architectures can be a little controversial sometimes with industry. They may not love the idea of the government dictating an architectural approach, and they may not like the specifics of the architecture that we design. And it, can, if not done properly, can have implications for the competitive aspects of programs that we may or may not intend. But I think it is the right approach intellectually, foundationally. It is the right approach, and if implemented well, and I'm confident right now in the leadership that we have and the efforts that are working that government reference architecture for us, that I am optimistic about the approach. But of course, feedback is critical, right? It won't work if the reference architecture doesn't serve the purpose for which it's intended. It doesn't promote effective competition with industry, and it doesn't provide a level playing field. So those are issues we very much have to pay attention to, and then we have to stay in constant dialogue with industry to make sure we can maintain that approach.
You mentioned ARCHI. I mean, government reference architecture, I would call the government owning the technical baseline. We understand what we want, and we have built the architecture to meet our needs. ARCHI did that. And then individual companies that participate in that, they still own their own IP. The architecture is different than their IP. And you're right, the advantage of the government is we own the architecture, we understand it. Somebody comes in, provides a product, it doesn't work, or they become obsolete. We pull that out. Somebody else's IP comes in, and so the company's IP is protected, and the government and the architecture is not proprietary, which means it's flexible. So I know ARCI, now it's called SWIFTUS, does that, and Canes, another Navy program, does that. Why don't we roll into one of my questions? Secretary Lord worked very hard to persuade Congress that software development was fundamentally different than other development. And as you pointed out, it's not invent it, design it, build it, produce it, and then maintain it. It's just those all occur simultaneously. So in response, Congress set up a new budget line, BA8, Budget Activity 8, which is software money, and identified I think 8 or 9 pilot programs, that's been implemented the last couple of years. Seems to have a fairly cool reception so far, at least in Congress, with regards to traceability and credibility, that that they can see what we're spending, what the department is spending money on in software. Do you have any thoughts on that, or any experience on that in your time in your current seat? Over.
So I have to say, one of the things I first asked about when I came in is, I'm really interested in these software pilot programs, and I'd like to learn more about how we're doing with them. And I discovered with some dismay, and you can, laugh at me a little bit for not having known this already, that the Air Force actually doesn't have any of them. They were. So that is not from lack of interest. The Air Force submitted several candidates to be part of the software pilot program, but we were unsuccessful, in the competition for being selected. The Navy is a tough competitor, I have to acknowledge that. And of course, the Army is no slouch either. So there it is. We aren't currently executing a software pilot program. Now, maybe I'll feel less bad about that if the Congress decides they don't like these and, takes an axe to them all. But currently, I'm rueful that we aren't doing it. And it's maybe slightly ironic, because I like to think the Air Force was a leading voice in making the case for the flexibilities required to do effective software development. So having said that, obviously we can use the tools we do have outside of the pilot program to try and still be effective in achieving the right outcomes. And that's what we're doing. And I think we have been able to leverage the funding tools and mechanisms that we have to try and be as successful as possible. And I think there are smart things that we can do in terms of using reprogramming authority effectively, and also being conscientious, I would put it, in our budget justifications, so that we don't box ourselves in more than we intend to, because RDT&E is a very flexible color of money in many cases. O&M can be a very flexible color of money. And if we're conscientious about how we articulate our budget justifications, we can open up the aperture and space for us to do the things that we need to do in software acquisition. So that's what we're doing. But I do think that I am hopeful that the software pilot programs will demonstrate the power of BA8, and maybe down the road of other appropriations mechanisms that could do the similar purpose for the government.
Okay. Another question from the audience, Shelley Mesh. What are the biggest challenges in the current methods of acquisition? How does the process need to change to meet pacing threats? You touched on that a little bit in your remarks. Wonder if you can expand on those. Over.
Yeah, we would like to think we're doing a relatively good job. And I'll be honest, to me, the biggest limiting factor is not the way we do our acquisition process. The limiting factor is money. And I also touched on that in my remarks, that, we are resource constrained. Our ability to field new capability is fundamentally impacted by the capability that we're trying to operate and maintain at the same time. And absent an infusion of new resources, we have to make trade-offs, and that is painful. It's challenging. The Congress doesn't always like those trade-offs. It is their right and their obligation and duty to question those trade-offs and make sure they're the right trade-offs. And so we've gone through that exercise with the Department of the Air Force, and we're going through that exercise again with the 23 budget request, and we will go through it again with future budget requests. It's just going to continue. I do think that's the major limiting factor. I think we've done pretty compelling and interesting things with the rapid prototyping and rapid fielding authorities that Congress has given us in the last 5 years since we've had those authorities. But I think it's also evident that it didn't lead to this sudden rush of capability fielding. because we were still resource constrained. So we were able to prototype a lot of really interesting and compelling things. But when it comes to fielding, that takes a lot of money. And so we were still constrained. And that's the problem that we're trying to solve with our divest and to invest approach. I did mention that, we have been able to cut the timeline on the front end of programs. In many cases, I think we've been able to, I'm going to say, liberate the process of risk reduction and prototyping has allowed us to identify key subsystems and components and buy down risk as we go through the process of doing a more formal kind of JSID style requirements process and the things that will lead to a major capability acquisition program down the line. So I think it's been a good marriage of getting out and doing early risk reduction activities through prototyping and enabled us to, in some cases, to get a more competitive approach in the early life cycle stages while we're doing some of the deeper, longer term analytical work that has fed into a major capability acquisition program at the same time. So that's where I think I've seen a lot of power in this approach.
Excellent, excellent. One thing you didn't mention was cyber. So we have a question from Michael McGrath. As we expand digital acquisition, we face increased cyber risks. Government mandates on protecting data are problematic for smaller suppliers in the defense industrial base. Do you have any thoughts on that process? And is there something we can do to help the small businesses that are challenged in that area? Over.
Yeah. First of all, I don't want to be a Pollyanna about it. I think it's a huge challenge. It truly is. I will say, so of the operational imperatives, I didn't maybe foot stomp at the number 7, where I talked about hardening our information systems. That's all about cyber. So it is part of the operational imperative picture, and it is key to our efforts. And as I've gone through programs, I mentioned the nuclear modernization programs, which are top priority. Cyber is an absolutely critical factor in a number of those programs and a critical reason why we need to modernize some of those systems. And I would point to GBSD in particular in that vein. In terms of the ability to access small suppliers, one of my concerns early on about digital acquisition and digital engineering is, would we squeeze out the small suppliers because the investments that are required to be able to participate in these very sophisticated engineering environments would perhaps be too steep for some small suppliers. And that is a concern. It's something we need to keep our eye on. However, as I've dug into it more, I think there's actually aspects of digital acquisition and digital engineering which address some of these challenges. And so, for example, if we are able to establish a government-run platform to serve as a software development environment and say to industry, you can come into our environment, which we are then responsible for securing and for provisioning and do software development there, that may be an enabler for small businesses who can't go off and build their own digital engineering system, but they could participate in our system that we've provisioned and that we've set up and that we've secured. And so I think in that respect, if we're smart about this, it actually can be an enabler and a helper to getting more innovative small businesses engaged in some of our big acquisition programs.
So the Air Force has been a leader, I think, in the software factory concept. Navy's trying to catch up, and I think that's exactly what you're describing is a government enclave. Businesses come and operate inside that, and all those protections accrue to those businesses. So that's excellent. Well, we are about out of time, sir. I very much appreciate your candor. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and again, welcome back to the symposium. We look forward to hearing from you again next year, and I appreciate the update on Air Force. And I'll tell you, as you're talking Air Force, I'm right down Navy, and there's pretty close to 100% overlap in terms of issues and common concerns. The names might be a little bit different, but the principles are the same. And I think you have pitched about a dozen potential thesis topics. So for the students that are listening, they're taking notes along with the faculty. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate your time, and And I wish you a wonderful day. And if you could try to dial in every once in a while, we really appreciate your participation when you can. So thank you very much, sir.
I hope I get a chance to, and it's great to join everyone. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, sir. Out of here.
We'll start off. Thanks.
Correct.
Recording in progress.
Thanks, everybody. We'll wait a few seconds here while participants join. Zoom is a big room, but it has a narrow door.
Always like working with you, Dave.
Of course, one of the real tests is how many people were listening to Mr. Hunter, took a break, and aren't going to make it back.
I think the top peak was 122, something like that. So. Okay, why don't we get started?
Right.
Welcome, everybody, to our first plenary panel session. Be moderated by Mr. David Berteau. He is, oh, by the way, please don't be shy about asking questions. We have a Q&A chat line for you to use, so don't put it in the chat, put it in Q&A, and then I'll be asking the questions after the presentations are complete. So Mr. Berteau became the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Professional Services Council on March 28, 2016. His prior assignment was as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Material Readiness in December 2014. Prior to that, he served as the Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Berteau, over to you.
Thank you, Admiral Lewis, and thanks to everybody for joining us here today. I want to in particular thank the Navy Postgraduate School and the Acquisition Research Program, and I think also Dave, your Warfare Center as well, which is a really, I know it's a combination, a bit of fortuity, but I think it's a tremendous asset for putting on this program every year. I think it is unique in its attempt to combine real research, relevant research, with both programmatic and national security issues writ large. And it's a very capable and competent group of people that you have that contribute to it. I look forward to a number of the panels. I actually wish I could be there for all of them and divide up. And I'm hoping we can come back and watch some of the others later. And in particular, our panel this morning kind of rises up a level to really look at a question of new priorities and familiar challenges. When we proposed this panel, there were a number of challenges that we didn't see coming. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, inflation, not only in America and worldwide, but in particular in the defense business, and the election dynamics that we face today. But we knew there would be both twists on familiar challenges and new priorities coming into play. We'll open this up with a bit of a slide presentation, and then we have a tremendous panel to address some of these questions and topics. Most of you just heard Andrew Hunter, who's the Air Force Assistant Secretary and of course a longtime supporter and participant in these annual symposiums. And he talked a lot about the familiar challenges, starting with nuclear modernization on down to how do you bring innovation and technology into systems and how do you do it faster. I call these familiar challenges because these have been dynamics that have affected the DoD budget and resource allocation process for decades, if not longer. DoD's in constant competition for resources internally amongst all the components and the ideas, externally with the White House as the budget is put together and oftentimes as it's being defended, and of course with the Congress to both obtain the resources and then to use them properly. But even within just the familiar challenges, the existing challenges, that competition's intense. And there's more priorities than there are dollars. There always are. But the addition of new priorities by any administration only intensifies that competition. So the question that we ask ourselves this morning, the core question is, how will these new priorities, or will these new priorities, fit into the struggle to resource the responses necessary for what I call the familiar challenges? So it's a real privilege to be back here this morning, of course, and none of this would be happening without the incredible team, Dave Lewis, that you have together, Carrie Schaefer and Nadia Greer, Michelle Johnson, all the rest. We're so grateful for their excellent work. And I would like also to mention a tribute to a great friend of mine for more than 3 decades. That's retired Admiral Jim Green, who's always seen the importance not only of this symposium, but also of the critical role that excellent focused research plays in defense acquisition, in programs and resources, and essentially in defending America and freedom around the world. So my thanks have to conclude with a hearty thank you to Admiral Green, and I know all of you on the participants who know him will join me in that thanks. I am joined this morning by an excellent panel. David Norquist, who's the president and CEO of NDIA, and a former deputy secretary of defense, and of course, a lot of things before that. Shannon Hines, who's the senior vice president at Textron and former staff director of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and Eric Tuning, a partner with McKinsey and Company, former chief of staff to the Secretary of Defense, former deputy assistant secretary for industrial policy, although I think that title kept changing over and over again, but industry's always in it as far as that goes. So we're going to start this morning with the short slide presentation, and then we'll have commentary from each panelist, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions. You don't need to wait until we open it up. If you've got questions, go ahead and type them in the chat or in the quick Q&A box now so that they'll be ready when we want to go forward there. So let me bring up the first slide, please, James. I'm going to switch my own Zoom to, there we go. All right, so this is the title. Let's go on to the next one. So we start with money, because without dollars, there's no allocation of resources for priorities, either for contracts or for the rest of what DoD does. And I don't have a lot of particular comments to say. I've got 3 main points to say on this. What you see is actually the appropriations for each fiscal year, all the way back to FY11 up through FY22, with on the right-hand side, the president's budget request for FY23 and an FY23 column that has question marks in it because we don't yet have either a target number or numbers or a target date for that. I go back to FY11 because that is the last year of appropriations before the Budget Control Act caps went into effect. And the 10 years between FY12 and FY21 constitute the 10 years of BCA caps. There's 3 key points about those caps. Number 1 is they changed every 2 years. So there was a 2-year deal each time, 12 and 13, 14 and 15, 16 and 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Each 2-year deal made modifications to the caps. The changes were connected. Increases in defense tended to be matched by increases in civilian agencies and vice versa in the early years here. And those 2-year deals, an interesting dynamic happened. We always focus this as a cap, as a ceiling above which you cannot go. And that was a big factor in building budgets and allocating resources. But what happened over time is the ceilings also became the floor. It essentially became the number you knew you were going to end up at, even though you didn't know when or how you were going to get there or how it's going to be divided up. And so what this slide shows is broken down basically into 2 categories. The blue at the bottom is defense. The gray at the top is non-defense, mostly civilian agencies, a little OCO sprinkled in between, 2 levels of OCO. The big one that you can see, which is the light blue, that's the defense OCO. The little one at the top, which is really just a number almost indecipherable at this scale, which is the civilian area OCO. You'll note that in FY21 is the last year with OCO. But something changed here. When we reached FY22, the caps were no longer in place. Many of us had been waiting 10 years for the caps to no longer be in place. But the problem is we had no ceiling. We also had no floor. And so we went into the FY22 budget negotiations without any agreement on the number or the distribution or the allocation of those, and with no agreement on the second year of that. We got through it, big increase in defense, big increase in civilian agencies, commensurate with history. When defense goes up, civilian agencies go up in order to get the deal. And of course, the president's budget for FY23 continues that increase. None of us expect that FY23 final will be that lower column on the right-hand side. But that, by the way, is where we are likely to start if we begin the year under a continuing resolution. And we have begun every fiscal year except one on this whole slide under a CR. The only year that was an exception was FY19, and even that was only for 6 of the cabinet departments, not the whole federal government. So the absence of caps make us focus 1 year at a time, and that's bad for DOD, it's bad for governing, and it's bad for America. Why is that? Let's go to the next slide. Part of the reason is because we're never doing just one budget at a time. When you do 1 year at a time, you're only focusing on one. This shows you kind of a simplistic version of the concurrent budget processes that DOD undertakes. Right now, today, we are spending FY22 and a lot of prior year appropriations for 2-year money or procurement money or ship construction money or MILCON money. So we're spending the budget that we have, the appropriations that we have, either current or previous years. On the Hill, the administration is defending and Congress is beginning the steps to finalize the FY23 numbers, right? So the agencies are explaining their requests and Congress is starting to work towards authorizing and appropriating those funds. And inside the department, I mean, it's May, they're already well along with assembling the FY24 budget and the associated future year defense program that goes with it. One of the great strengths of DOD is a fiscally disciplined, long-term resource allocation and planning process. It's unmatched anywhere else in the federal government. It's actually unmatched almost anywhere else in the world. And it requires a lot of attention going forward, but it also means that if you're only working 1 year at a time, you're really at a disadvantage with these concurrent budget processes. And until you get to very high levels within the department, there's very little institutional connectivity among or between these 3 different lines and processes that are in place there, even though they're totally mutually dependent on one another as they go through the process. Let's look at what it means if it's 1 year at a time. Next slide, please. This is kind of the timeline of what to watch. There's today on the left-hand side, very nicely placed in big and blue. And you can see, we're going through the rest of the calendar year, which is the black part, but we're not very far away. In fact, I think June, July, August, September, we are only about 4.5 months away from the start of fiscal year 23. And of course, I think it's almost a guarantee that we'll be starting that year, that fiscal year under a continuing resolution. The only question is how many of them and for how long they will go. And meanwhile, the 24 budget's being built. I put the OMB passbacks in here. They're often less relevant for DOD than they are for the rest of the federal government. But one big way in which the passback has an impact is the inflation target that gets built into the FY24 budget. And of course, a big driver here up at the top is kind of external stuff, not internal stuff, is the midterm elections in November 8th, the outcome of which will have a lot to do with whether we get a CR that ends in December with a full year appropriation, or whether, as so many times has happened after an election, that moves on into calendar year 2023 and may well overlap and impact with the submission of next year's budget. But that's the process by which all the familiar challenges are dealt with. Let's look at the new priorities. Next slide, please. This is just a list of some executive orders. I think there have been 88 executive orders signed by President Biden since taking office on January 20th, and that's as of May the 1st. I haven't updated it for this week yet. And then we pick a few out, and the ones we picked out here are primarily the ones that, from PSC's point of view, have great interest and potential impact on defense and defense contractors. Why? Because almost all of these executive orders have a clause or a sentence or a paragraph or a whole page on changes to be made in the federal acquisition regulation that will in fact drive changes in contracts and contractor behavior. And that level of attention, I would tell you in my experience, is at a higher ratio in terms of both the number of executive orders and the number of executive orders that are going to use contracting and acquisition and procurement as a mechanism of driving these priorities into the system, into the government, into the DOD, and into the contractors that support the government across the board. I'm not going to dwell on them, but if you look down the list, you'll see quite a number of familiar topics there. Made in America, pay raises, implementation of infrastructure, supply chain issues, but climate crises, equity and inclusion and diversity across the board, changes at a much broader social level than typically the federal acquisition regulations are used for. Next slide, it shows you it's more than just executive orders. There's 70 presidential memoranda, 249, I'm sure it's more than that now, proclamations, 47 presidential notices, and these are some of the areas that impact us. This is what I think of as the new priorities, even though some of them, like supply chain issues in microelectronics or forgings and castings, have been around for decades. Eric, I know you wrestled with them in responding to a previous executive order some years ago. So they're not new challenges, but they are changing and the dynamics are changing. So now let me have one more slide. After all of that, here's where that money goes in terms of contract obligations. I just have 2 slides here. This is DoD total contract obligations by fiscal year. I only go back to 17. We can go back as far as you want for research purposes. Well, not as far as you want, but we can go back into the 90s. And it's by quarter, by fiscal quarter. And you do see in FY19 a very interesting first quarter bump. That's the year we had a full year appropriation in August, and DoD was not suffering under the constraints. Dave Norquist, I remember you saying once about a meeting you had where all of the comptrollers across DoD said, hey, we don't need new guidance on CRs. We know how to do that. What we don't know how to do is how do we operate if we actually start the fiscal year on time with a full year appropriation in place? Well, it turns out we actually do know how to obligate contracts. And if you look at that, you actually have a smoother delivery of contracts across each quarter. It's more regulated, it's more normalized, you get stuff sooner. There's a lot of advantages that are demonstrated just in that one fiscal year. Big jump in fiscal year 20. That's not because it's partly because appropriations went up, but it's really driven by COVID expenditures that were supplemental funds in the CARES Act. And then that drop in FY21 is partially driven by COVID decreasing, and it's partially driven by the cessation of activity in Afghanistan and the ending of a lot of contract obligations and expenditures in Afghanistan in 21. And you see pretty flat in FY22. First quarter, DoD takes 90 days to release data, so I don't have second quarter data, even though they do. I used to think they did something with it during those 90 days. Then I went back to the Pentagon and discovered they really just sit on it. And it'd be great if it were released. Let me break it down, though, next slide, into contract for obligations for services on the left and for products on the right. Important fact is that roughly 50% of DoD contract obligations are for things that DoD categorizes as services. We agree with their definition, and 50% products. That's been a rubric that's been in place for a long time, well in advance of FY17. And what you see is, in particular, the bigger part of the drop, about twice as much of the drop between 20 and 21 was in products as in services. And what you see in the first quarter of FY22 is an increase in products dollars and a slight decrease in services dollars. We're looking forward to second quarter data, so we see if those trends continue. Obviously, the CRs for FY22 extended almost all the way through the second quarter as well. And so this puts a real burden on DoD to obligate one-year funds in particular before the end of the fiscal year or before the comptroller comes around and sweeps them up. Let me have one more slide. So this is our panel now. Obviously, myself as moderator, Mr. Norquist, Ms. Hines, and Mr. Tuning. So I'm going to turn to each of you in turn, and I think you can go ahead and take the slides off now. And we'll go to speaker view here. And so what I would ask is if you're on and you're not a speaker, if you would turn your video off, and I'm pretty sure your mics are muted already until the time comes for question and answer. So let me first open up with Mr. Norquist. David, I think that you've been in the position both as comptroller and as deputy secretary, where you were actually the funnel, the bottom of the funnel through which all of these competing priorities had to fold in. So walk us through a little bit how that happens and how you end up with a result that's both balanced and productive and defends America well.
Absolutely. And again, thank you everyone for joining us and for having us here today. So the first step is you have to start with the strategy, which in Department of Defense is the National Defense Strategy. And if you look at the 2018 NDS from the previous administration and the public unclassified outline of the 2022 NDS, what you see is some very common themes. So first, China is the long-term pacing challenge. Both parties, both administrations recognized that was where we were facing in the long term. Russia is recognized as the near-term acute threat. They know they're in financial difficulties compared to China. They understand that their time is short, and so therefore they're much more aggressive, much more likely to take dangerous provocations, as we've seen. Iran, North Korea, violent extremist organizations all make the list as persistent threats. But the core theme is the return to the focus on the high-end fight against countries that want to break the norms of the international order. One thing to note is we're in a very different place than we were in the past when we faced the Soviet Union or Japan or Germany, where the US economy was much larger and we could always count in the long run of just winning through capacity, just extra capability, and we'd push them out. That's not going to be true with China. Our GDP is much more similar to theirs, but we do have some key strengths that we need to look to. And again, both of these are brought up in the National Defense Strategy. The first is allies and partners. The United States is part of a large network of allies and partners that work together. Most of these other countries who are breaking the international order are not. And we have an innovative industrial base. And as we're able to take advantage of that, gives us a strategic advantage over those other countries. The leadership starts with this in the Department of Defense. Everyone starts with this understanding as you go in, as your services are building their budgets, as they're presenting their 5-year plans, their POMs, their 6-year programs to the department. And you get a couple of decisions early, right? You're going to decide whether you're going to fully fund the triad because of the fact that you're facing 2 nuclear powers and the importance of deterrence to being successful. You look at the scale of the Pacific and you start realizing your need for long-range strikes. In addition to those, you're looking at what are the emerging technologies that are going to disrupt, that are going to provide us opportunities. Heidi Shue produced her list. It was very similar to the one produced before. She added a couple of items. What you see is directed energy, hypersonics, biotechnology, quantum science, AI, autonomy, microelectronics. I think it's very reassuring that you can have different people in these positions, different administrations, and they're coming back to the same strategy and similar emerging technologies, which implies there's a stability in the strategic direction. That is very helpful to industry to understand that if you invest in a particular area, that's likely to be carried forward across time and across people. It's not necessarily true of other civilian agencies. It's not true for the Department of Homeland Security. They face a very different environment when they see a change, and that creates its own set of challenges. Now, it's useful to know where we're starting, but it's not enough to get there. You now need to consider your warfighting concept, and the joint warfighting concept, which the Joint Staff is working on to deal with anti-access and air denial challenges, creates another wrinkle in how you build it. And so here I'm just going to do a brief historical example, but it's basically the difference between the tank and the mechanized division. In World War I, the British invented the tank first. By World War II, the French had more of them, and some of them were more advanced than the Germans, but the French just put them alongside their infantry. The infantry advanced, the tank rolled next to them. It was the Germans who experimented with the different concept of tracked vehicles, combustion engines, radios, and realized that what they really need to do is to put some infantry on track, some artillery, and create these mechanized divisions. And then when there's a hole in the enemy lines, they could break through at the speed of a vehicle instead of a foot, and they could talk to each other with radios. And that dramatically changed the way the war went beyond the simple technology. The challenge we face today is everyone's chasing similar technologies, AI, hypersonics, directed energy. The real issue is going to be how they are used and combined, which puts a premium on getting the future warfighting concept right. And that pulls back into the POM because that gets to the question of force structure, basing, training, what skill sets you're developing and promoting so that over the 5 years as these technologies arrive, you can use them in different ways, and the combatant commanders are able to do something more than just the value of the individual technologies. So start with the strategy, you identify the technology drivers of change. You notice that we've had very large RDT&E budgets as a reflection of that. You build in what you know about the warfighting concept, and then you're left with some very clear choices. The first one is near term or long term. Where do you think the greatest risk is to the United States? Where do you emphasize your investment? This shows up in the debate over divestment. If you're more concerned about the longer term, you're more willing to take risk by doing divesting to free up resources. If you're concerned a conflict could come much sooner, then you don't want to take that risk. But you'll see that as a central debate as the department goes through it. You always have a series of administration considerations that you have to work in. Some of these have a dollar value you have to accommodate. Some of them are take time and leadership energy in order to implement, but they don't have as direct effect over your funding and your balance. Typically, the department is generally very accommodating. You do report to the president, you follow their guidance, and you try and as best you can incorporate those in a way that works in connection with your overall strategy. There are several disruptions that every administration faces, particularly early on in the administration. The first one is not everyone is confirmed. Even a year into an administration, not everyone is confirmed. And that creates challenges for the leadership trying to get all the input. You're typically settling most of your decisions, for example, on FY23 without knowing the outcome of 22. You generally don't get your top line till late if there's any sort of debate with the Hill. And as always, current events cause disruptions at the most inconvenient time because the bad guys get a vote. So a very tough environment. And so at the end of the day, whether it's in December or January, or whether because of a delay it's in February, there's a certain point where there's a final meeting between the secretary, the deputy, and other advisors, and they just go over one last look. Did we get it consistent with our strategy? Are we taking advantage of the technologies? Are we executing against the concept? Where are our balances on the edge? What are the last bits of choices based on either the increase or decrease in funding? And then you lock the budget and send it to the printer, knowing full well that the moment you do, the world is going to change on you, and you're going to have to explain for the next several months something you locked down months earlier. Last week, Deputy Secretary Hicks, when she was talking at the Reagan Forum, highlighted several challenges that she still faces, and I think they're well said, and I would reinforce them. The first one is inflation, and people talk about it like it's a 23 issue, but as she pointed out, for her, it's also a 22 issue. They have fuel pricing they have to accommodate. She doesn't know whether she's going to get a timely appropriation. That CR challenge is a real setback for the Department of Defense, that instability. And if Q&A, somebody wants to go into it, I'm going to have to, I'll dwell on that. Contracting for innovation. We have new adaptive acquisition tools, but getting everyone to use them to take full advantage. We're not going to beat the Chinese by being better at central planning. So we've really got to take advantage of our industry. And lastly is the capacity of the industrial base. I think Moshe Schwartz is going to talk more about some of these challenges, but sometimes even when you want to spend more money on a project, there isn't the capacity to ramp up the production the way you need. So at the end, you start with the strategy, you make all these trade-offs as you get to the budget. And then even when you're done, you're left with some very persistent challenges that make this life hard. So with that, let me pause and we'll go to our next speaker.
All right, thank you, David. And as Andrew Hunter said, Congress gets a vote here. In fact, they get as many votes as they want with that. So Shannon, you've been for a number of years on the receiving end of the results of this marvelous process that Mr. Norquist just described. So talk a little bit about how Congress takes a result of that executive branch integration of priorities and adds its own priorities and then enacts appropriations with usually a good dash of guidance along the way. So over to you, Shannon.
Good dash of guidance is a really good way to describe that. And I apologize. My video has gone off and I'm not sure why. So I'm not hiding in the background. Oh wait, here we go. Okay, there we go. Thanks so much. I mean, I think as Dave, you mentioned in your presentation, uncertainty of the budget process and the overall political environment has in many cases created turmoil within federal agencies and their ability to plan and flex where necessary. And certainly that has created issues for the Department of Defense and then all of the residual industrial base actors that help the department do what it does. I think from my perspective, the budget environment has really emerged, this particular kind of budget environment has really emerged since passage of the Budget Control Act, which resulted in sequestration. And then, as you said, really resulted in kind of this regular cadence of discontent about overall spending levels, how you distribute the top line between defense funding and non-defense funding. There are good years and bad years. I come from the Hill where that's all relative, and I definitely appreciate that. But we've evolved from a place where we had to get it done. Appropriations was the one thing that got done relatively on time every single year. And in my 27 years of being on the Hill, it became that one thing that you could always count on that was always going to be at least 6 months late, if not worse. Which is unfortunate, right? It makes it difficult for agencies to plan. It makes it difficult for those that rely on federal agencies for the bulk of their work to plan. So I think there's always been this push-pull, but it has become incredibly dynamic and unpredictable since we've seen more polar opposites coming into Congress and folks not appreciating, just to be real frank, the need to compromise and work together. And while certainly a 2-year agreement sounds like a great idea and the avenue to success, I think your chart, Dave, showed that only in 1 year over the past, frankly, almost 20 years, has that been a successful path. And I think, and certainly I am biased in that it was my former boss who came in as chair of the Appropriations Committee in 2019, working with Senator Leahy, who agreed to set all of the politics and the discontent aside and just establish a baseline in order to move forward using those top line numbers. And you saw bills get passed before the end of the fiscal year for the Department of Defense's first time in 10 years. So I think there is a path forward. You just have to have willing participants. And while we were successful in doing that 1 year, we weren't able to do it again. And I think this year is not going to be an outlier. It's the same, I think the same dynamic is going to occur. And there isn't a top line agreement for this year. And Ukraine has really thrown a wrench into how you move forward and address. I think it has caused a great rethinking of how we spend DoD dollars, how we categorize readiness for ourselves, and how that impacts the overall defense industrial base and our supply chain. Frankly, we've talked about that for years. I think Ukraine has really helped to focus us on how can our defense industrial base and our supply chain react quickly. And I think the answer is it really can't in its current state. It's hard. It's hard to get things back up and running. So, I think the acrimony in Congress, I think CRs, all of that has added to kind of how do we have a stop-start kind of process within DoD? CRs are hard, right? But as David pointed out, right? He knows how to deal with a CR. He doesn't know how to deal with a full year bill when he was at DoD. I think we saw that the agencies learned how to address CRs. One of the things I was always confused by was the continued mantra of a CR would be devastating. A CR would cause great problems. But regardless of the administration, there was never a solution, right? Aside from pass bills on time, and that goes without saying, but there was never a real solution to how do you address a CR, right? OMB can apportion money, but what happens when it gets to the agency? I always wondered why, as opposed to just give me a giant pot of money and let me spend it how I want, when I want, why there wasn't more constructive discussion. And maybe this committee that is within DoD, I think David is a part of that. Maybe there'll be more discussion of that moving forward about how you address that going forward, because certainly DoD plans for the out years. It's just a question of what does that look like and how closely do they hew to that particular planning versus kind of gaming the system these days. So kind of enough about CRs. I did want to talk a little bit about budget proposal versus appropriations process versus budget execution, and how that truly impacts defense industrial base and supply chain, and frankly, how I see it differently now that I'm on the outside versus when I was on the hill. I think the Russia-Ukraine conflict has really kind of had folks thinking about that more in a way that they didn't previously. The administration has certainly undertaken efforts to have more Buy America, more domestic sourcing. And that's great in theory, but in reality, the investments that DoD, Vice, the private sector is making in the defense industrial base and the supply chain is limited to those investments that are made, in my view, to new technologies, right? So we're not investing or not willing to invest in maintaining legacy systems, so to speak. And there's always been this push-pull between divesting to invest. And certainly when I was on the Hill, I was a big proponent, right? You shouldn't be paying for legacy systems if you're going to get rid of them and you're not going to use them. But I think where I see the split now more acutely is that certainly if you are going to transition out a legacy system to transition in a new system, you still need to plan for how do you maintain that equipment? How do you maintain readiness? How do you ensure that if you need pieces and parts to repair, that you're not cannibalizing your existing systems, if you even have them, to cannibalize in order to maintain something that you know that you're going to need for the next 10, 15, 20 years until the new latest and greatest thing comes along. And I think that's really where kind of this discussion about domestic, the defense industrial base and the domestic supply chain comes in and is really relevant right now, right? When you let production lines go cold, totally cold, you just shut them down, getting them restarted, finding people that can do the work, finding the parts to put into that equipment becomes more and more difficult, and it increases the price for the department ultimately, and it increases the lag time. So that's longer that particular equipment is offline. So I think that's something that as we go forward, there should be more discussion and more focus on, particularly if our focus is one where we really want to onshore more of our stuff, and we really want to maintain our defense industrial base. So with that, I'll leave it and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a good, quick summary, although we could probably spend the rest of the time on any one sentence you said there as we go forward. So Eric Tuning, so there's an industry side to this as well. In fact, I'm struck by David Norquist's comment about Deputy Secretary Hicks talking about the impact of inflation on DoD and citing fuel. Every single company I know who's a defense contractor is suffering from similar inflation impacts, and probably the biggest piece of that is not in the supply chain; it's in the workers. It's wage inflation. DoD doesn't use the CPI, but guess what? Workers do, and they look at what their lost earning power is, and particularly in a marketplace where there are almost twice as many job openings as there are people looking for work. It's kind of a workers' market in that situation. But above all that, industry has to participate in this process. And what's interesting is they can't really bid and win a contract until the money's been appropriated and apportioned out by OMB and flowed down to the programs. And yet industry has to watch it. Go back to my three arrows, right? The spending, the defending, and the assembling. Industry's watching it from the very early stages of the assembling process, even though they won't actually get a dollar out of it until the late stages of the spending part of the process, 2.5, 3 years later. So how does industry deal with this? How do they prepare to be able to respond to and deliver the products and services that DoD is going to need to support its missions and functions as they go through this process? And how do new priorities potentially come in and affect that? Because you've dealt with some of those.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. And also, it's great to be on a panel with you and David Norquist and Admiral Lewis and Shannon. And also, candidly, it's great to be able to connect with all of you, because all of you out there in Zoom world right now are at the kind of the coal face on this issue, and are going to be able to really impact change. And it's great to be able to get in discussion with you. Listen, I always think it's good to follow the money. With any organization, being able to follow the money kind of gives you a sense for what the priorities are. And with DoD, budgets play a really important signaling role to industry. And I think there's two elements of signaling that are really germane to this group. The first is DoD's demand signal for the type of technology or solution that it wants to buy. And as David indicated, there's an implied force structure choice here, right? I may want to buy more submarines, fewer 5th-gen tactical aircraft. Hopefully that's been informed by a joint warfighting concept as an example. And if that's the case, right, then the department is signaling we have a joint warfighting concept. The warfighting concept is impacting our force structure. It's impacting how we're thinking about technology. I'm sending a demand signal out to industry that says, I'm going to need more technological solutions that can do these types of missions. In addition to the force structure element of that, there's also a signaling around potentially specific technology requirements, right? I always think of something like rad hard microelectronics are a good example, right? We're looking for this type of requirement on our radiation hardened microelectronics. And that tells industry, all right, that's what the department wants to buy. I need to get organized around that. And that's really when we get to the second piece of the signaling. there's an implied production capacity industry needs to meet that demand. And David, as you indicated, that demand, it could be around the workforce, it could be around the supply chain, it could be around the physical assets. And what's really critical for the markets that are a monopsony, markets effectively where DoD is the only consumer, DoD's demand signal, the first element, is going to set the industry structure because there's no one else who's going to be able to buy similar types of products, right? There aren't any other, no one else buys the type of, nuclear aircraft carriers are a classic example, right, of the size and scale of the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet. So what I would submit to this group is, I think collectively we've spent a lot of time, and when I say we, I mean the department and industry together, the broader industrial base, has spent a lot of time on that first dimension around the demand signal, the technological solution. And we have not spent enough time on number two. And since the Last Supper, at the end of the Cold War, the DoD message to industry on number two, the capacity, has been, I want a smaller workforce, I want to reduce cost overhead, I want to reduce facilities, I want to get more efficient, I want to use commercial best practices like lean, I want to leverage a global supply chain, I want to use just-in-time inventory, because all those things are going to drive down cost. And driving down cost is important, it's a priority. But it's also left us with an industrial base that's not capacitized for a major high-intensity conflict. And I think we're seeing that play out now in real time with respect to Javelin and Stingers. And just go to the comments the CEOs of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon have made about that, right? And the lead time it's going to take to ramp up production for those weapon systems, over the next 1 to 2 years, right? And as Shannon indicated, it's not as simple as just turning on the crank at the prime level. It's the demand signal the prime needs to send all the way down to the supply chain, multiple levels, and they need to make investment decisions and to meet whatever that new demand forecast is. And so I think one of the ways DoD and industry really need to partner much, much better is around the integration of war planning and industrial-based capacity planning. And just to make that tactical for everybody, here are the types of questions that we need to be asking ourselves that I don't think we could answer right now. So how long would it take DoD's material community and industry to regenerate losses from our most taxing war plans at day 10, 100, and 365, right? Real confidence around how long it would take for those replacements. Does the material community and the primes have the type of multi-level supply chain insight to begin to ask the questions around the capacity data, right? Not just at the prime level, but when you get down to tier 3, tier 4, tier 5. And if they get the data, do the PEOs have a framework that will ingest all of that information, both structured and unstructured, and then actively manage it so supplier and capacity assumptions change, it automatically updates, right? Because everybody in this Zoom knows that a supply chain is not static, it's dynamic. And so if you may take a snapshot in time, it's only good for the moment you took that snapshot. It's constantly changing. And once we've built that for a single program, we have a way of scaling that across services and ultimately at the OSD level so that you understand the coupled effects across program supply chains, right? And so what I mean by that is, let's just take an example that may impact Indo-PACOM, right? In a high intensity fight there, you may be in a situation where you need more SM-3s and you need more THAADs, right? Well, you may go and contract those from different primes, but the reality is there's a lot of commonality in the sub-tier of that supply chain. So a demand signal for, say, an SM-3 may inadvertently crowd out a demand signal for a THAAD. And then the response is going to be back, all right, well, let's DX it. Well, you can't DX everything, folks. It's around prioritization and how that works. And so this is hard stuff, and there is not a magic solution for any of this, right? And this is going to take real thinking in terms of how do we get to that level of insight, and then candidly, how do we address the costs associated with that, right? And who's going to bear the costs associated with that? And this is a conversation, if you take it out of the defense context, that is happening everywhere where there is a multinational supply chain right now. So it's not just a DoD discussion. It's a broader discussion that's taking place across industrial enterprises. And so, but the DoD impacts are going to be unique, and they're uniquely important because they're going to drive how we think about execution on the war plan. So, sure, we have an opportunity to discuss that further, but I'll pass it back to you, David.
Eric, those are fascinating observations, and certainly everything that I see, it's almost impossible for any major defense contractor to actually know its supply chain down to the 8th, 9th, 10th tier where the silicon is coming out of the ground or the minerals are coming out of the ground, and that makes it even more difficult. There's a lot we could spin on from yours. I will ask one more question of the other two panelists, and then Admiral Lewis, I'll open it up to questions from you and the participants here. So David Norquist and Shannon Hines, you've now heard from Eric kind of how industry thinks about that dynamic. So David, for you, how does DoD take that into account? In particular, what does DoD assume as you're building those priorities in the budget? What do you assume about industry's ability to deliver on the products and services built into that budget? And Shannon, to what extent does Congress listen to industry concerns or even be aware of industry's concerns as part of that dynamic, as what's in the president's budget and what's in the assumptions behind the president's budget and what's not? So David, first you, and then Shannon.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Whoever is the master control of my video has to undo it so I can be seen.
One of the features of Zoom is we can turn you off, but for reasons of potential embarrassment, we can never turn you back on without your permission.
Well, it says I can't because the video host has stopped it. So now you've allowed me to return. Okay. I have returned. Still says the host is preventing me from joining.
Stealth mode, David, stealth mode.
All right, I'm back. I exist. I returned from the wilderness. Excellent. All right. So when it's done right over the course of the development of the budget, there are extensive ongoing conversations between the department, the program managers, and industry to make sure, are we putting in over the 5 years, and particularly in the budget year, correct? Is it executable? Now, it's a little bit of a tricky question because no one knows exactly what was the previous year's purchase, so they have some amount of work, and there's events that happen along the way. As one points out, when it goes to the Hill, they then get several months of information that people building it didn't have. So often their changes are quite rational changes to, you weren't where you thought you were going to be at the time you had to assemble it. But when it's done right, there's enough of a conversation between the acquisition community, between the program managers and industry to understand where is the program, where is the status of the parts, the supplies, the deliverable, is there backlog, are there foreign sales that are going to have an effect on what can be done? This is one of the reasons why it's so important for government and industry to meet and talk on a regular basis, because when you don't have that communication, you can have all sorts of breakdowns in the budget and the strategy. And so associations like yours, PSC, David, or ours like NDIA, that are forums that regularly bring industry, DoD, and Congress together to have that educational understanding in an ethical way is key. The bottom line is, frankly, most defense issues are not partisan. They're just really hard. And so whether it's supply chain, capacity, contract flexibility, the key is trying to put everyone in the room and work together, and then recognize that when the facts change, the answer changes, but that doesn't mean the people who put it together made a mistake. They just had different data. And when the Hill makes a change, it's not them being mean. They just had a different piece of information. And usually it's the department's program managers and the contractors who went to the Hill and explained it. So, it's just a meeting moves its location. They used to be inside the Pentagon. Now they're up on Capitol Hill. It's the same people having that conversation. And before we go to Shannon, I should add one point, having also been on the Appropriations Committee. When we talk about the CR, you're not talking about a problem with the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee could pass the appropriation bill on time, every time, if they were given the running room to do so. And the staff is amazing in turning things around on short notice. So part of what you're seeing is all the external pressures and decisions tying up a process that, I explained to people when I was in department, when I was there, we passed the Defense Appropriations Bill in July before the August recess. And they look at me like granddad's talking about riding dinosaurs to school. But the answer is you can. When you get the leadership together and they move, it moves. All right, I'll pause there.
Right. And Shannon, your comment about Mr. Shelby and Mr. Leahy getting agreement, it wasn't just the agreement between the two of them. It was getting the leadership to go along with it. That was really the remarkable exercise there. I won't ask you what we do to make that happen going forward, but back to the more narrow question. What does the Congress think about, and how do you think about industry as part of the review process that's undertaken there?
I think, David is absolutely right. And he's uniquely positioned, having, sat on appropriations and been inside DoD and kind of been on both sides of the equation. We on the Hill definitely did engage the department, the program manager, the contractor to understand what what had evolved, what had changed, maybe what did get taken out of the budget that shouldn't have, or what didn't get taken out that shouldn't have. And I think you see that. I mean, if you're, nerdy, like I assume most of us are, right? And you read, it's like excess to need and, behind schedule, all of those things, and all of those things emerged between that long lag time between when the department put the budget together and when Congress executed on it. And you even see the difference between when the House took up the appropriations bills and when the Senate took them up, right? There are remarkable differences where Senate can take some cuts that the House didn't because they didn't know about them, they didn't have time, or they hadn't emerged at that point. So it is definitely a collaborative process, right? We don't always agree, but I mean, if you look at the overall DoD budget, for me, having come from not the DoD world into the DoD world for the majority of my career, it's the only place ever where we took as fact the department's budget request and just edited it. Like I was used to just writing a whole new thing. So, I think that speaks volumes about the comity between the department and Congress and the contractors, right? Because it needs to be a collaboration so that we get things done right. I think that's ultimately what we want. And we want to make sure we're responding appropriately and that, not everybody thinks the same way, but making sure that we're thinking about things collectively and that everybody understands what everyone else is doing.
Muted. Now I'm unmuted. What my mother would have given to have a mute button on me back in my childhood. So Admiral Lewis, I think we could obviously keep talking to ourselves for a long time, but let me open up for you and questions from the participants. And you're the curator here, so
okay.
We're at your service, sir.
So first, two observations. Mr. Norquist, thank you very much for the tank Panzer Division example. That is superb. So the technology is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. What you do with it operationally does matter. I'd point out the Soviet Union learned the same things at the same time as the Germans. Unfortunately, Stalin didn't like his smart, creative generals and executed all of them, and well, 2/3 of them anyway. So they forgot, and then they had to learn it the same way the French and the British and the Americans learned it, which would be the hard way at the end of a barrel of a gun. So, I think that's one of a couple of really superb examples of just putting the box out there is not enough. You need to know what to do with it. So thank you for that. Second thing is there was a very robust discussion about inflation in the chat. So I'm going to ask about inflation, but I want to start with my own experience with inflation, which was in the DDG 51 Arleigh Burke shipbuilding program. We bought DDG 51 in 1985 for $1.4 billion. We bought the last DDG, which turned out not to be the last DDG, in 2005, DDG 112 for $1.2 billion. And those are checkbook dollars, then your dollars, whatever, real dollars. So in 20 years, the price of the ship stayed the same or went down a little bit. And oh, by the way, DDG 112 was a much better ship than DDG 51 was. So when people tell me about inflation in defense, and the thing the program did for that was competition, multi-year procurements, and basically incentivizing the shipyards and the suppliers to keep their costs down, which they did. And my personal view is inflation is a thing which the government can control, as Eric said, in the monopsony environment. We are the customer. We dictate what we are willing to pay, and so I differentiate between real inflation and pretend inflation. I mean, during those years, the price of steel went up, price of steel went down, price of copper went up, price of copper went down, but also the labor costs went up. But the labor content in the ships went down by 25%, 30% in most cases. So yeah, the labor got more expensive, but the shipyards got better at using what they had. So I just offer that as an example. So I'll lead off with the inflation question. What can the department do today, given that we have real inflation? What are the things that you all think the department should be doing or could be doing to attack the inflation, the current inflation issue? I am a child of the 70s and 80s. I remember 13% interest rates. I remember stagflation and all that stuff. I think most of you are probably in that era also. Over.
Yeah, I came to defense in 1981 when we were at the inflation rates that we're now comparing them to as the historically ones that are higher than today. And one of the first actions that the Reagan administration took was to provide substantial additional top line funding to DoD to absorb that inflation, and created separate inflation indices that could be used for various parts of the defense budget. Of course, it took a while for that to come into play there. But before I talk about inflation, I want to turn first to David Norquist and then ask if other panelists have something to add. So David, how would you tackle this?
So I think one of the challenges is inflation was so stable for so long. I remember when I was in the private sector, you just signed a contract and there was some number less than 2% out through the fight, and you didn't worry about it. You signed a 5-year service or delivery contract, and it was so consistently in that range that it was a rounding error, and you didn't tend to focus. So the challenge you're going to have in part is some of the contracts have that built in, and the answer is that particularly if it's cost plus, then maybe there's a way that the system automatically accounts for it. But if it's time and material or a labor-based contract or one where the supply chain is the driver, the vendor's not going to be able to work at those. So I think there's both what do you do about existing contracts? There's provisions and adjustments that contract officers can make, though that depends on the department providing them the resources in order to be able to adjust their program for the higher costs. What it also changes the way you issue future contracts so that you either decide you can project inflation, or for a period of instability, you figure out what is the right metric for the type of contract you're issuing and the type of service you're buying, and build that in, or an adjustable one, just for mortgage type of thing, where you know that there's going to be adjustment, and therefore the vendor doesn't have to price the risk in on top of the cost of the product to be able to insure themselves against that level of uncertainty. The last thing you want to do is encourage people to price in uncertainty when you could have pulled that out of the system. So those are a couple of the tools that I think we have used in the past. And part of that is bringing those back into the system because they've fallen out of use because frankly, they just weren't necessary when everything was stable.
Well, let me make a couple of additional points to that. You're absolutely right, David. We've had such stable, low inflation for so long. One of the dynamics that we see in industry is most contracts no longer have an economic price adjustment clause in them. And without that clause in the contract, it's a lot harder to create the dynamic in which the contractor and the program office and the administrative contracting officers can even enter into a dialogue. But even if they could, you've got a situation where you really can't wrestle with this FY22 inflation issue one contract at a time. I think there are two steps that DoD could take, and I see Eric has his hand up. He probably has a third, fourth, and fifth step. But step number one is actually top-down guidance to the contracting community and to the program offices that they support that says, here's a problem. Here are the tools you have available to deal with it. You don't have to deal with it one contract at a time, and you don't need Mother May I permission if you have the funding available to and the solicitations are sufficient. You can come into play. GSA has essentially done that for contracts on the GSA schedules. They've opened the aperture to multiple requests for equitable adjustment and multiple opportunities for programs to spend the money if they have it. The second thing I think you could do is, this is the time of year that you start the annual sweep ups of unobligated balances, put covering inflation costs for the companies into the mix of what you would use those unobligated balances for. Now, the appropriators may not like that a whole lot because they like those unobligated balances to free up money in FY23, right, to go forward. But if you don't get through 22, 23 is not a problem you're going to fix right now. Eric, additional thoughts you have on that from industry's point of view?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of things. I think one is like the inflationary effect we're all feeling is real, right? I mean, it's just, I think we can't sort of like assume it away. And listen, economics 101, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And we're in an environment where we had massive fiscal stimulus. on top of what had been massive monetary stimulus. And then we had supply disruptions from the pandemic. Then we had a second set of supply disruptions from the war in Ukraine. So the system has got to like process a lot of what's going on. And I think it's important to distinguish between what's the short-term, inflationary shock effects we're going to see, and then what's the longer-term inflationary environment that we may be in, right? And the extent you can distinguish between the two, that's important. And I think the third piece is to understand not just the temporal dimension, but the inflationary impacts on different portions of the economy. David Barteau, you mentioned the wage impact, right? Right now, I know we have manufacturers in the defense industrial base who can't keep manufacturing people employed because they could make as much money going to a fast food restaurant down the street, right? And so that's going to have an upward impact on wages. Nominal wage increases are super, super sticky, right? So if we come out of this period with a significant increase in manufacturing wages, those are going to stick, right? Because that's the way nominal wage rates work, right? Your human capital is your supply chain with feelings. They're going to stay there. But you may see relief on other portions of the economy, whether it's fuel costs or other commodity groups. And so I think that temporal dimension, it's what type of inflationary impacts based on commodity or input that we're seeing. And then also just a recognition that it's real. It's going to take a while for the system to process. And, there needs to be I think to your point too, David, are we making the right budgetary adjustments in our inflationary assumptions so that there doesn't end up being a adverse impact on the DoD's purchasing power in the short term as we're trying to figure out where we ultimately land?
Shannon, how does Congress think about this? And in particular, what are the options for a this year fix?
Thanks. So, I was going to kind of comment on David's comments, but also yours, right? So equitable adjustment, right, is something that is a bit of a sticky wicket. We saw that during COVID. David and I had many conversations about how do you help the industrial base address some of these cost escalations that are, short-term, long-term, one-time, recurring. How do you do that? Ultimately, your suggestion of kind of a top-down approach, kind of a scattershot, you can't do it contract by contract, was something that Congress really frowned upon on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, right? That it needed to be done on a case-by-case basis, that we really needed to understand and see the data, that this big, effort to make these adjustments in perpetuity, frankly, or from a broader perspective was something that Congress wasn't particularly fond of. The other thing that I would say is just from a congressional perspective, right, sweeping up, unobligated balances is certainly something that could be negotiated with Congress, as to how you use them. And I know that, I left right before they finished 22, and the inflation issue was something that we tried desperately to address. And while there was a whole lot of money, there wasn't, there's never enough money to do everything. And it wasn't quite quantifiable in order to address it in a way that made the collective comfortable. And I think that that's kind of what you're going to see moving forward for Congress. They want to be helpful, but trying to quantify that is important. I take the point on DDGs, and costs going up and down and being able to do a firm fixed price contract because, the more you make, the more the more efficient you become. But I think right now that's probably, it's a different dynamic, right? Because we have inflation, we have labor shortage. I know that at least for my company, Textron, we go out to suppliers to get a quote to get some, the things that we need, and their quote is good for 24 hours. It doesn't even give us time to go back to the government to then kind of explain, all right, this is why our costs are going to go up. And they're like, 3, 4. Now that may be a game that everybody's playing, but these inflationary pressures are real. And they're caught, in addition to the labor shortages and the people that are working for us have all of the cards, right? And so, right, that's driving costs as well. So I think it's going to be a bit of a different conversation than we've seen in the past, just because I don't think we've ever seen an environment like this where you've got these inflationary pressures, workers, have all of the power to negotiate much higher wages, and then kind of have this supply chain problem. So I think it's just a recurring problem that I think we need to find other more deliberate tools as opposed to just kind of scattershot, like here, go fix it. I think we need to have a deliberate process. And I think that involves DoD and Congress working with the contractors to figure out what that looks like and what they're really seeing.
Well, and for services companies whose assets mostly, I used to say walk out of the door and go home every night. Now I'm not sure they ever leave home in about 50% of the cases. The lead time for fixing that is essentially zero because you can't spend money on a worker that you're going to, if you lose money on every hour that you work, you're going to go out of business pretty fast. Eric, you had your hand up and then down again. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to, I think, just to highlight something Shannon said. I know we're talking about this in the context of the defense industrial base, but we'd be having the exact same conversation if we were an automaker right now, or if we were a consumer electronics company or anything, right? And so, what Shannon had said about the 24-hour quotes, that's true across industries right now. And so I think it's important just for this audience in particular to understand this phenomenon isn't isolated just to DoD. DoD is just having to deal with the effects like every other large industrial enterprise right now globally.
Admiral Lewis, I think we've got about 9 minutes left. You want to do a scatter shot of multiple questions, and then we'll each.
Well, actually, there's quite a few questions on the industrial base and supplier base. So I'll try to walk through those kind of top down. I think the highest level question is from Ned Swanson at the AU. Can anyone on the panel share examples of success in rebuilding the industrial base in the continental US towards domestic reliance for defense critical components, such as chipset production, specialty metals mining and processing, non-tactical vehicle, automotive parts, small arms ammunition, precursors such as primers? So does anybody have any examples of us onshoring successfully? Over.
The best example I know of was actually the Sematech program, 1989-1991, which invested a chunk of both DPA and appropriated funds, DPA and non-DPA appropriated funds, into helping to integrate the emerging technology into America's domestic chip production base. Not a lot of money, nothing compared to the $52 billion in the China Competes Act or whatever that act is called these days, or that bill is called these days. But it was a singularly successful story in terms of increasing the percentage of the domestic production capacity at the high end of chips while maintaining what DoD relies more on, which is the two generations or three generations removed chips, because that's what's going into our systems today. It was relatively long-lived until globalization really took root earlier in this century. And it was, I think, a tremendous success story, and the return on investment was phenomenal along the way. I don't think it works today, though. Eric?
Yeah, what I was going to say is I think we're in mid-experimentation on a lot of different fronts around this. Ultimately, what I think the right balance is going to be, it can't just be the department working the supply side. The supply side and the demand side of the equations are going to have to get met. What I mean by that is, now I'll pick rare earths as an example. We can invest in the processing capability for certain rare earths here, the heavies, let's say. But if we're also not addressing the demand side, you're effectively creating something that won't be competitive globally. And so we have to make sure that as we address the supply side of the equation, we're also making sure they're going to be competitive, or that there's going to be a market for them, at least in the short term, that will then enable sort of the business cases to fully close. You can't address one side or the other.
That's a good point. I should add to my Sematech example, it benefited tremendously from the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And so the demand side was pretty dramatically reduced at the same time as we were working the supply side from a commercial point of view. David Norquist or Shannon, any things you want to add to that? All right, Ms. Lewis.
Okay, then the next one is a term I had not heard before, but I think I might like. Ally shoring. In other words, not onshoring into the United States, but onshoring into a close ally as a supplier, part of our industrial base. It says, building on Eric Juning's comment and the DoD supply chain report, are there ways to use the ally shoring concept to increase capacity, even as nations understandably prioritize their own industrial bases?
Well, Eric, you probably followed the administration's implementation of the Made in America Act and the FAR clause associated with that. It has made some progress in terms of ratcheting up the level of domestic content over several years, up to from 55% today up to 75% in a few years. It does have the exemptions. There's an ally exemption for it. The process by which those exemptions have to be agreed, I believe, takes the head of contracts or the SAE for the military departments presenting a case, and the Made in America office of the White House has to go along with it. That strikes me bureaucratically as not a speedy process or one through which a lot of approvals can be made. I know there has been one, actually two, but they were both the same issue. Decisions already made, but we're going to have to do a little better pace than that going forward. What's your response to that question?
I'm happy to jump in. It looks like Dave Norquist has got some comments too.
Got it.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think it's certainly the right thing to highlight that there's cognitive dissonance to a certain degree when we talk about sort of all these different requirements and how do we get them all integrated in the right way. I mean, I'll throw another one out there, the NTIB, right? The National Technical Industrial Base, which is enshrined in law, around how we get, a shared industrial base across the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom and Canada. And then with the AUKUS framework as another dimension, right? I mean, how are we going to think about special sharing of technologies between those countries? What I'd suggest is I think let's be tactical and pragmatic about it, right? Let's pick certain areas where there's shared interest, and then let's scale that. So, I'll come just be consistent, right? We come back to rare earth capability, right? We know that the security of that supply chain is a concern to the Japanese, the Australians, the Europeans. There's an opportunity for us to work together on that collectively as we think about sort of creation of that demand profile. I would get really tactical. I'd get really integrated, and I'd treat it like an interagency task force.
David Norquist?
Yeah, I think to build off of that one, I'd also say, and start, the easiest is look at raw materials, right? There's a fundamental difference on a raw material that is dependent on coming out of China and a raw material that comes out of either Australia or Canada. And so when you're looking at where your supply chain risk is, what you're trying to understand is what's the disruption you're protecting against. And in a conflict, for example, which is usually the more dramatic one that DoD focuses on, is what happens if the shooting starts, who's going to still play nice with me? Those make a big difference on what you're willing to accept as non-US supply lines and being able to track that. So I think those are some of the easiest cases. And when I was in the Department of Defense, it was very clear to us there's a difference on the raw materials, where it came from, even before you got to the question of whether the processing was in the United States. So that's the second part that goes with what I think Eric rightfully said, is you look at individual cases to understand what's going on.
I think there's two other aspects that come into play here, Admiral Lewis. One is, the department has a long history of, we have to be prepared to go it alone if we need to, right? And that flies against the idea of let's build the capacity that we need in our allies. And that's both at the front end in terms of development, design, and production, and probably even more so at the back end in terms of sustainment and logistics and support. I would submit that one of the places where we could get the greatest early bang for the buck is at the back end, particularly with respect to China, where both the capacity and the potential capability are there in a number of our allies in a way that they're already buying our stuff. We could build the sustainment and support capacity infrastructure in place. In fact, I would submit that we ought to do that as part of the offset, because it'd be a great way to get the offset without undermining any capacity here. And even the maintenance depots and the shipyards would probably go along with it, because they're chock-a-block right now. They can't absorb any more work as it is, right? And so you'd really complicate Chinese thinking. You'd not only create the ally shoring aspect of it, but you really complicate Chinese thinking with respect to any future content. But until DoD recognizes and accepts the possibility that we're okay depending on those guys, it's an inhibiting factor in the process here. I think we're getting close to the end of time.
I think we have run out of time. So I thank you, David, and I thank all the panelists for your time and effort in preparing. I think we had a good, robust discussion. There are another 10 questions stacked up. So you obviously hit the third rail, so that's good. We'll see if we can't get them to you anyway. But thank you again for your time and your preparation and your insightful comments. This has been an excellent panel. Over to you,
Well,
Ben.
unlike government witnesses, we're not required to answer questions for the record, but we'll be happy to consider them. I did neglect in my thanks at the beginning, Robert Mortlock and the academic side of the postgraduate school, and I really want to recognize the tremendous support that's given to this program over the years, and particularly for today. Thanks particularly to the panelists. You guys have really stepped up. You made me happy to be here, and I think we've covered a very broad range of topics, and we could have gone much deeper into any one of them. Thank you so much for your time and your effort here, and thanks to the audience for following along.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.